Chapter 4 4th of March. Somewhere near Kherson. Taras could feel the truck finally coming to a stop. He, along with many of the soldiers and volunteers who were defending Kherson, were taken as prisoners. He remembered several trucks worth of prisoners, although they were all taken to different places. He couldn't tell where he was taken, along with those in the same truck as him. They all were kept in the back of the vehicle, with hands tied and bags over their heads. "Out!" came a stern voice once the back of the truck was opened. Taras felt someone pick him up with force and drag him out of the truck. Then suddenly the bag over his head was abruptly taken off, and he was blinded by the bright light. It took a few seconds for his eyes to adjust to it, and once they did, he saw an old building in front, some sort of abandoned military barracks. He turned in the direction of the truck and saw Russian soldiers taking other prisoners out of the truck too. When every prisoner was out of the truck, all of the enemy soldiers came together into a small group and faced them. "Listen up, Khokhly," one of the Russian soldiers began. "This is where you'll spend the next few weeks and possibly the remainder of your miserable lives. Now follow us single file." The word Khokhly that he used was a well-known derogatory term used on Ukrainians. From the moment Taras heard that word, he understood their captors would be treating them with excessive humiliation to try and break their morale. He expected no decency or mercy from them, and he knew they would do undignified things to him and the other prisoners. A handful of the Russian soldiers led the way, and the prisoners followed them. The other soldiers kept observing and following behind, making sure no prisoner tried escaping. Every captive person had a beaten expression on the face, and many of them were continually looking at the ground. Once inside the building, there was hardly any natural light. Mostly, there were dark corridors and dimly lit rooms. Only the main hallway was well illuminated, as it had windows and a reasonable number of lights. The building as a whole was in poor state, and clearly was not used by anyone for a while. The paint was peeling off of the walls in many places. Thick layers of dust were covering the tables and chairs, and there were old cobwebs hanging off parts of the ceiling. It was surprising that there were still a few lights there that even worked. The prisoners were all gathered in the center of the main hallway, which was spacious enough for everyone. The Russian soldiers began forcefully shoving a few of the prisoners at the back of the line forwards. "You're all here. Good," one of the Russian soldiers announced. "I hate the fact that we have to look after scum like you, but these are our orders. None of us here is in the mood, so it's in your best interest to behave yourselves and do as you're told. Is that clear?" There was no response from prisoners. Many were still confused and emotionally down. "He's talking to you, you piece of shit!" Another Russian soldier came from behind the prisoners and slapped one of them in the back of the head. "Is that clear?" the first Russian soldier asked in a louder voice. The prisoners all acknowledged with a simple yes that they understood the rules. The Russian soldier who was giving instructions then carefully looked through all the prisoners, and his eyes eventually stopped. "You two, over here, your heads need to be shaved." Two of the female prisoners stepped out of the group. They seemed to be the only women among prisoners. The Russian soldier motioned for them to stand separately and to be taken to another room. Taras was hoping these women would be treated with some sort of decency, but he knew that his hopes were unrealistic, and the Russian soldiers would probably hurt and humiliate these women. What was to come in the next few days was anyone's guess. Taras surrendered himself to fate. He had no idea if he'd still be alive, so he chose to think of his family, his wife Vika and their two small boys. He desperately desired to see them again at this difficult moment, wondering if this would ever happen, or if he'd never set his eyes upon them again. 4th of March. Kharkiv. Ksenia was sitting by her friend's side. Olesya was laying in a hospital bed and had been making a great recovery over the last few days. She was meant to be discharged from the hospital on this day and was now waiting for her dad, Vadim, to arrive from Kiev. Ksenia was supporting Olesya all these days, not leaving the hospital at all and making sure Olesya had everything that she needed. The nightmares continued to torment them both, ruining their sleep and kicking their mental state to the ground each time. Suddenly, a knock on the room's door. Both Ksenia and Olesya turned towards it as it opened. Vadim was here already. As he came in, Ksenia saw Olesya's face light up with a smile, the first time it lit up this whole week. Vadim also looked incredibly elated and relieved to finally see his daughter. As he entered, he walked straight to Olesia's bed. Olesia sat up as much as she could and gave her father a very tight hug, which he returned with the same amount of love. For a moment, Ksenia could see tears running down Olesia's face. "Dad, I missed you so much," said Olesia after wiping the tears off her face. "I missed you too, darling," Vadim said. Tears were running down his face too. "I'm so sorry I was not here for you and for Anton." "It's not your fault, Dad. It really isn't. Please don't blame yourself. I'm just relieved you're here now." Vadim turned to Ksenia at this moment and nodded gently. "Ksenia, thank you for looking after Olesia all these days. I'm sure she couldn't have asked for a better friend." Ksenia just smiled and felt shy to receive a compliment. She was always ready to help her friends, especially Olesia, who was her closest friend for many years. "Did you speak to your mom already?" Vadim turned back to Olesia. "No. I don't even know how to begin. TV in Moscow is likely telling her entirely different things to what is really going on here. I expected for her to phone me first, but she hasn't yet. We still should tell her everything she deserves to know. Alright, but let's get home first. I'm tired of this hospital room." Ksenia and Vadim helped Olesia off the hospital bed. Her injured shoulder and arm was still really sore and her range of motion on it was limited, but she could walk fine. Ksenia got hers and her friend's personal belongings and they all left the ward. Once in the car, Olesia chose to sit in the back seat. She was terrified to be anywhere near the front. Her anxiety was so strong that she was keeping herself low down in her seat, in an almost laying down position. Ksenia could imagine how terrified her friend was. She also felt anxious being in the car again and being driven through the streets of Kharkiv, but she could hold her worries under control. Vadim was driving the car and Ksenia noticed that he was very tired. "Are you okay?" she asked him. "Maybe it would be better for me to drive." "I've not slept much these past 2 nights," he answered. "But it's fine. I should have no trouble getting us home." They were driving back to the apartment where Ksenia lived together with Olesia and Anton until recently. Ksenia felt her mind and body being on high alert, carefully observing every street to make sure someone wasn't about to shoot in their direction. She also kept regularly turning towards the back seat and checking on Olesia too. She was greatly worried for her best friend. The roads they took were mostly clear and they got to their destination a few minutes later. Ksenia breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car. She looked around again, noticing that it was quiet. A few buildings in the distance were damaged and were likely hit by enemy missiles in the last few days. The neighborhood around the apartment building, however, was still unharmed. Vadim helped Olesia out of the car and took her things. Ksenia waited for them and then led the way to the apartment building. The inside of the apartment was just as they left it. Once there, Ksenia felt a little safer and she could see that Olesia was feeling the same way. Although catching a glimpse of Anton's belongings was reminding them of that horrible day when he died. Olesia gave Ksenia a hug from the side, holding on to her and burrowing her own head in Ksenia's arm. "Hey, it will be okay, Olesia," Ksenia said as soon as Olesia hugged her. Olesia was silent. She was obviously missing her brother a great deal. Vadim brought the rest of the things from the car and closed the front door of the apartment. A few minutes later, once they managed to make themselves comfortable, Olesia began trying to phone her mother who lived in Moscow. Ksenia could see her friend looking worried and contemplating something, likely wondering how she would start the conversation. Olesia took a couple of deep breaths and then began dialing the number. It took a few attempts for the call to go through, but eventually it succeeded. Olesia put the call on the speaker so everyone in the room could hear it. "Hello?" Olesia's mother, Uliana, answered the call. "Mom, it's me, Olesia." "Olesia, dear, how are you? I heard something is happening in Ukraine. Are you okay?" "Not really. There is a war here, Mom. The Russian forces are destroying our cities and killing our people." "That can't be true. It's only a small military operation to get rid of extremists." Uliana was refusing to believe the news from her daughter. "I take it Anton was an extremist then? Because you know what? They killed him, Mom. He's no more." Olesia began weeping when she said that. "Anton was killed? How did it happen?" A tone of fear and sadness was heard in Uliana's voice. "We were trying to flee the city, and they opened fire on our car." I don't know what to think, dear. I just wish you two were safe here with me." "Maybe it would have been better if you were here with us instead." Are you sure our people did this? Maybe those Nazis did it. Our people would never attack peaceful civilians. It's not why they went on this operation. Think what you want, Mom. If you want to believe the propaganda they feed you on TV, then so be it. I only phoned you because you deserve to know about Anton. I won't be calling you again. Before her mother could reply to that, Olesia hung up the phone and firmly placed it on the table in front. Tears were still coming down her face. Ksenia put her hand on Olesia's shoulder to show support. Olesia just continued staring at the floor in sadness. Vadim was also speechless and couldn't find the words to say anything. Ksenia thought it was insane that the mother would not believe her child, or kept finding excuses for what was happening. How many lies were they fed over there, that they refused even to believe their children? 5th of March, Mykolaiv. Solomea came for her shift at the hospital as normal. The days had started to blur together. The emptiness inside of her after losing Timur continued to persist. What was the point in living? She thought. Her country was falling apart, her beloved was gone, and she was on her last threads, fighting on, trying to move forward. But forward to where? To what kind of future? She needed to focus and push those existential thoughts away. Her superiors mentioned a few minutes earlier that there were some wounded soldiers that needed to be treated. Among them, she was told, one was a Russian soldier, captured during one of the recent battles on the outskirts of Mykolaiv. The idea of needing to treat an enemy soldier was making her nauseated. As she walked through the hospital halls, she noticed that the number of people being treated was increasing each day at an alarming rate. There were so many wounded, and not just soldiers, but civilians, women, older people, kids. Some of them sustained injuries worse than anything she'd ever seen. There were even several dead bodies inside body bags just lying in the corridors. Evidently, there must have been so many dead that there was no more space where to place the corpses. It was unsettling. After a few minutes, she reached the ward where she'd be working. A couple of other nurses were already there, tending to the wounded. The Russian soldier was in a separate room on his own. He was laying on the hospital bed, his head turned towards the window. His left leg was bandaged in several places. When Solomea entered the room, the soldier heard her and turned his head to look in her direction. He was incredibly young, slightly older than a teenager. This was unmistakable, even despite scrapes and bruises on his face. "Hello," he said mildly. Solomea ignored his greeting, and her face was still stern. Anger was boiling up inside of her. This man, this being, this creature, he was part of the enemy's forces, the same forces that brought death and destruction with them, the same ones that killed Timur, the same ones that were going to continue to kill many more people. And yet, she was supposed to help them? To waste her time and precious medical resources on this monster? A part of her wanted to grab a scalpel or another surgical tool and just jam it in his throat, to make him feel the pain that she was going through. But this wasn't going to change anything. This would not stop the pain being inflicted on countless civilians. And this would not bring her beloved back from the dead. "I know you probably feel hatred towards me," the soldier continued after a minute of silence. "Hatred? If only that was accurate enough to describe what I'm feeling," Solomea replied in an ice-cold tone of voice. "I'm sorry, I had no say in any of this. You carried out the orders to kill, to destroy, to inflict pain. I didn't do any of that. I've not shot anyone. I was delivering supplies to the others." Solomea didn't respond and instead picked up the medical report left by another nurse, which detailed the wounds the soldier sustained. Solomea began scanning through it. The soldier's name, Pavel Morozov, age 19. 3 bullet wounds in the left leg, 2 in the thigh and 1 in the calf. All were flesh wounds and did not damage the bones. He lost a fair amount of blood, however, and there were signs of infection. "They say I'll be alright soon," Pavel spoke again. "You could say you're lucky. No shattered bones and no major arteries damaged. But you'll need to stay here for at least a few more days. You'll be feeling feverish and weak." "I understand everything. I'll stay for as long as needed. Will it just be you looking after me today?" "No, the other nurses will be around too. Somebody will keep checking on your condition regularly." "Thank you, nurse." Solomea did not respond afterwards and instead began preparing the medication that would need to be administered to stop the infection spreading at the soldier's wounds. In her head, she was constantly fighting with herself. Why should I bother to save this man? Was a recurring thought. Each time, however, she kept bringing herself back that her duty was to save lives regardless of who the people were, that fighting evil with more evil was not a solution. Her thought process was interrupted by a loud, thunderous clamor coming from outside. More shelling. It lasted for almost a minute while she stood still. A few of the impacts sounded very close. Too close. Solomia still couldn't get used to such terrifying sound. She knew that whenever it came, it meant only one thing: more death. She imagined what would happen if this very hospital was hit. The doctors and the nurses couldn't exactly spend the entire time in the underground shelters. They needed to work round the clock, and in recent days, the number of injured people coming into the hospital only increased. They simply had to continue working and saving lives, regardless of what was going on outside. You know, I didn't realize at first what we were doing, Pavel said once the shelling stopped. We were told we would be fighting extremists, not peaceful civilians. Solomia looked in his direction, feeling lost and not knowing how to even respond to that. After failing to pick her words, she just sighed. Pavel continued. Don't worry, you don't need to respond to me. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm having a hard time reconciling what I've been told by my superiors and what I've been seeing here over the last few days. I'm afraid at this point in time it's too late, Solomia interjected. Many good people have died already, including the love of my life. I'm sorry to hear that. Solomia didn't want to talk about it anymore, and his sorry was meaningless to her. It was too painful to discuss this. She finished administering the medicine and then silently walked out of the room to tend to other wounded. Once she was back in the corridor, she saw Nadia there too, approaching closer. Nadia smiled when she saw Solomia and gave her a hug. Solomia, glad to see you fighting on. How's today? Today is the same as yesterday, just a continuous struggle with my thoughts and emotions. It will get better, dear, trust me on this. I know, I just hope it'll be soon. I don't know how much longer I can fight myself. Don't try to suppress your pain. You need to let it out. Only then you can move forward. I understand. Thanks, Nadia. As always. By the way, today is my last day for a while. I'll be going to Kroprivnitsky tomorrow where my parents live, Nadia reminded her. Of course, I hope there will be less craziness over there than here. You deserve a little break. Oh, I'll be working there too. I'm afraid no breaks for us. People need medical care everywhere at this time. They agreed to stay in contact and said goodbyes to each other. Nadia carried on along the corridor to the next ward, while Solomia resumed her work here. She still needed to check on other wounded, and lots of work was ahead. Time did not wait for her pain to heal, and people depended on her. She knew that well, and she knew she had to stay strong. 5th of March. Bucha. A loud noise from outside alerted Maria while she was peacefully sitting and playing a little word game with her daughter Alina. Her husband Artur was sleeping at the time, as he got very little sleep the night before due to air raid alarms. The noise that was coming from outside awoke him. It wasn't the noise of missiles raining down on the buildings. It was something else. Alina, stay here and keep your head down, Maria told her daughter, and then got up really fast and ran towards one of the windows. Artur joined her and looked out of another window. At first, it wasn't clear where the noise was coming from, but after a few more seconds, they finally saw what was causing it. A big line of tanks entered their neighborhood. These were enemy tanks, as they were clearly marked with the letter Z, a strange symbol that the invaders had on a lot of their military vehicles. Some of the tanks forcefully knocked down the wooden fences of nearby houses and parked in their back gardens. The others continued further. A sharp, cold sensation of fear overtook Maria. The occupiers had passed through this area before, although it was only briefly and in smaller numbers. Now, however, a whole group of them came here, and it looked like they were aiming to stay. Russian soldiers were now walking all over the street in front. Some were approaching the front doors of people's homes and knocking. 2 of the soldiers approached their house. The cold sensation Maria was feeling increased its intensity, and she started getting a cold sweat all over. Why are they coming here? What do they want? The soldiers were now at their front door, knocking. Artur walked slowly up to the door, reluctant to open it. It was, however, no use trying to pretend that they were not home. That wouldn't have stopped the soldiers, who might have even attempted to break in. Arthur decided to open the door. "Yes?" he asked. "We need everyone out of the houses and onto the street," one of the soldiers demanded. "Why? What's going on?" "Shut up and do as you're told. Is it just you two?" One of the soldiers looked inside their house and appeared to have seen Alina in the living room. "You two, over here," he signaled for Alina to come over. Maria was frozen in terror and desperately wanted to know what these soldiers were planning to do. As Alina came up to the front door, Maria grabbed her by the hand and brought her closer to herself. She would not let anyone hurt her daughter. "Bring your phones with you, and if you have any tablets or laptops, bring them too," the Russian soldier continued making his demands. "Okay," Arthur obeyed and took his phone out. Maria followed suit and took hers out too. "Just these?" the soldier asked, expecting them to surrender their other gadgets too. "Yes," Arthur said firmly. The soldiers then motioned for them to exit the house and follow them. The other soldiers were doing the same to other residents of the area, getting them all onto the street and putting them into groups. "Arthur, what are they doing?" Maria whispered to her husband. "I don't know. Maybe they want to loot our homes," he guessed. Maria felt like the nightmare of this invasion was about to get worse. The feeling inside her kept ringing an alarm at full intensity, telling her to run as fast as she could, but she couldn't leave her family and her home behind. The enemy soldiers then began to separate the men from the women and children. One of the men tried to resist being separated from two of his small children, so the soldiers knocked him onto the ground and began violently stomping on him in an attempt to teach him and everyone else a lesson. Arthur was taken from Maria and Alina too and pushed into a group with other men. "You five, form a line over there," one of the soldiers pointed at the group Arthur was in. Another soldier took a few other men with him. "Can we please discuss this peacefully?" Arthur tried to reason with one of the soldiers. "We're just civilians, we're not armed at all." The soldier ignored him completely and instructed for them all to get on their knees. Arthur and the other men in his group did as they were told, hoping not to anger the occupiers. The Russian soldier walked up to the first of the men and took that man's phone from his hands in order to look at the messages on it. "Have you been sending any messages to the Ukrainian armed forces, huh?" The soldier yelled right in the man's face. "No, of course not." "Good." He kept the man's phone and then walked over to the next man, forcefully taking a phone from his hand too. "And you? Colluding with Ukrainian officials, are you?" "No." "I don't believe you." "It's the truth. What do you want me to say?" The soldier raised his gun and aimed at the man. Maria's heart began racing and pounding like a frantic drum. Would they really shoot him just like that? The Russian soldier continued aiming his assault rifle at the civilian's head, and then, at the last moment, he lifted his rifle up slightly and shot just over the man's head. Every civilian in the area jumped from shock and fear. "Perhaps I'll believe you for now," the soldier said, and then continued further. He now walked up to Arthur and snatched his phone as well. "So, are you a spy, huh? Been posting any anti-Russian messages?" "No, I've just been at home trying to keep my family safe," Arthur responded in as calm tone of voice as he could. "Lies! You work for the Ukrainian military." The enemy soldier then aimed his rifle at Arthur and without any delay shot at him. Maria screamed at the moment this occurred, terror taking over her within a fraction of a second, ripping all the air out of her lungs and making her choke. As Arthur collapsed onto the ground with a bullet hole in his head and a puddle of blood forming on the ground, Maria fell on her knees, crying and grasping her daughter tightly. A flood of violently painful emotions filled her. A sense of hopelessness took over that was flowing into anger and depression at the same time. Alina was sobbing together with her mother. She was holding onto Maria at the neck and pressing her face against her mother's cheek. For a moment, Maria wanted to recklessly attack the Russian soldier just so that she'd die right there and join her husband. But knowing her daughter was still there, she couldn't do such a thing. She knew Alina needed her and she could not abandon her. The soldier who shot Arthur then walked up to two other men who were on their knees. They were trembling whilst holding their phones up. The soldier took their phones and didn't even look through them. "I'm going to give the two of you a chance," he said. "You see the road ahead? You can make a run for it. Go to your freedom if you wish." The two men remained as they were, confused by what he just said to them. "Are you deaf? Go on then, get up, run if you can. If you don't move in 3 seconds, I'm going to shoot you." Both men quickly got up onto their feet and, in a panic, began backing away. The Russian soldier laughed and started firing his gun at the ground next to their feet. The two civilian men got terrified even more and broke into a full run. The Russian soldier then aimed higher and fired at both fleeing men, taking both down with ease, as though it was just casual target practice for him. "Hochli never learn," he said to himself, and then headed to join other soldiers. Maria was in utter shock and horror at what she was witnessing. She was seeing pure cruelty unfold in front of her eyes and in front of the eyes of her daughter. She couldn't stop her tears at all. All she could think about was why they were punished so harshly and inhumanely. As she gazed around, she saw other Russian soldiers carrying out similar acts of cruelty on other civilian men, executing them on their knees, or making them run only to get shot in the back, or simply beating them to a pulp. She could not even imagine that human beings could be so sadistic to just kill civilians for fun. She realized that pure evil arrived in Bucha that day.